Let me paint you a picture. Deep space. Sector 9 of the Callum Expanse. A region so economically irrelevant that even pirates avoid it out of professional self-respect. This is where Callum Rayo, known to literally no one as a hero, was flying a cargo hauler held together by hull-grade epoxy, stubbornness, and one very load-bearing prayer. The ship was called the Midden. Cal had not named it that. The previous owner had. Cal had never changed it because, honestly, it fit. He was mid-meal when the boarding clamps hit. Not a dramatic meal, not a Last Supper. It was rehydrated grain porridge with some dried protein strips he had been slowly working through since the Harkin Station layover. It was, by any reasonable standard, a terrible meal. But it was his terrible meal, and someone had just interrupted it. Pip's voice filled the cockpit at roughly the volume of a small catastrophe. Cal, Vorkai, warship, boarding class. That is a boarding class vessel, Cal. Hull breach, in 30 seconds. Their weapons array is charged. Their weapons array is very charged. Cal, I need you to acknowledge that I am saying words to you right now. Cal stirred his porridge. I hear you, Pip. And it needed another minute anyway. The hull door blew inward. Cal picked up his bowl and moved to the cargo bay. No point letting it go cold. Groth, supreme warlord of the Third Vorkai Dominion, breaker of the Senok Pact, and conqueror of 4 systems whose names Cal would never bother to learn, stepped through the breach in a cloud of pressurized vapor and absolute certainty that he was about to terrify someone. He was 7 feet of scaled muscle, ceremonial armor plated in something that probably cost more than Cal's ship, and an expression that had, historically, made grown diplomats choose early retirement. Behind him, 6 soldiers fanned out in perfect intimidation formation. They had rehearsed this. You could tell. Cal was standing at the cargo bay workbench, eating porridge, and looking at them the way a man looks at a delayed connecting flight. Groth let the silence breathe. That was technique. That was craft. The silence was supposed to do the heavy lifting before he even opened his mouth. Cal used the silence to chew. Then Groth reached back, drew Korovax from its sheath in one long, practiced motion, and held it at full extension. The blade caught the cargo bay lights and threw a sweep of cold reflection across every wall. It was, genuinely, a stunning weapon. Ancient, hand-forged, the kind of object that made you feel the weight of history just by being in the same room as it. Cal set down his spoon. He looked at the sword. He tilted his head left, then slightly right. The way a man does when something is not frightening him but is genuinely capturing his interest for an entirely different reason. Then he said, "Hey, can I borrow that?" Groth blinked, which, on a Vorkai face, involved a secondary membrane. It was involuntary. He had not blinked involuntarily at an enemy in 11 years. "You," Groth said slowly, "wish to borrow Korovax, the eternal blade, forged in the fires of the Dorkai collapse, carried by 7 generations of my bloodline." "Just for a few minutes," Cal said. "I have got this dried grain block from Harkin Station. The shell is too dense for my knife, and that blade looks like it has got a real thick spine on it. I just need to get through the casing. I will wash it after." Pip, from the cockpit speaker, made a sound that was not quite a word. It was more of a quiet, despairing tone, the sound of a small AI watching a situation it had no category for. Groth stared at the human. The human stared at the sword. Somewhere in the middle, the boarding operation lost the plot entirely. To his credit, Groth recovered quickly. He pulled the sword back, drew himself up to his full 7 feet, and activated what Cal would later describe to Pip as the voice. Every warlord had one. The register that dropped half an octave slowed to exactly the pace of someone who has never once been told to get to the point, and carried the specific energy of a man who had prepared remarks. "You stand," Groth began, "in the presence of Groth Vel Korovan, supreme warlord of the Third Vorkai Dominion, breaker of the Senok Pact, conqueror of the Helen Reach, the Druvak Corridor, and the twin systems of Orvan. My bloodline stretches back 14 generations to the first warlords who carved civilization from raw stone and the blood of their enemies. Korovax has tasted the defeat of 47 commanders across 3 centuries. It has never been borrowed. Cal nodded through all of this with the focused expression of someone taking a mental note. Growth continued. You are one human, in a ship that my sensors initially mistook for debris, carrying, according to your manifest, dried foodstuffs, miscellaneous hardware, and what appears to be a significant quantity of a spice, with no registered trade value. You have no weapons array. You have no crew. You have an AI unit whose distress signal has been broadcasting since we arrived, which suggests it does not find you particularly reassuring as a commanding officer. That is fair, Cal said. And yet, Growth said, leaning forward, you asked to borrow my ancestral blade, to cook. To break down a grain casing, Cal clarified. Technically, I am not cooking yet. That comes after. Growth's left eye twitched. What I am trying to communicate, Growth said, with the careful enunciation of someone managing genuine emotion, is that you should be afraid. I get that, Cal said, and I respect the effort. I am just also hungry, and that grain has been sitting in my bag for 4 days because my knife cannot get the leverage. Look. He picked up his knife from the workbench and held it out. See the spine on that? Too narrow. It slips. But yours, he pointed at Korovac's. The curvature on that blade, just behind the guard, that is almost exactly the profile you want for a downward splitting technique. Whoever forged that knew what they were doing. Functionally, I mean. Separate conversation from the whole ancestral legacy angle. There was a pause. One of the soldiers, the one standing second from the left, leaned about 4 degrees forward. It was not a dramatic movement, but it was a movement. Growth noticed it and chose not to acknowledge it, because acknowledging it would require addressing the fact that his boarding party was developing a mild curiosity about knife geometry. You are not, Growth said, responding to this situation correctly. Probably not, Cal agreed. But here is my position. You are going to do whatever you are going to do, and standing here being scared is not going to change the outcome. Whereas if I can get into that grain, I can at least eat well first, which, honestly, at this point, feels like the better use of the next 10 minutes. Growth looked at this human for a long moment. The human looked back. Pip, very quietly, said, Cal, my threat assessment model does not have a category for this, and I find that deeply upsetting. Growth handed over the sword. He would later tell himself it was a strategic decision, a display of supreme confidence. The gesture of a warlord so unthreatened by a single unarmed human that he could afford to be generous. This is what he would tell himself. We will leave it there. Cal took Korovac's with both hands, which was the correct response given that it weighed approximately as much as a small engine block, set the grain casing on the workbench, lined up the blade, and brought it down once with the clean, unhesitating confidence of someone who had done a version of this 10,000 times in worse kitchens than this. The casing split perfectly. The smell hit the cargo bay immediately. Not a dramatic smell, not the smell of something expensive or rare. It was warm and slightly sweet and deeply familiar in the way that certain smells are familiar even when you have never encountered them before. The kind of smell that finds something old in the back of your brain and sits down next to it. Every Vorkai soldier in the room reacted. Not visibly, not in any way they would admit to, but shoulders dropped by a fraction. The grip on 2 rifles loosened slightly. The soldier, second from the left, the one who had already distinguished himself by leaning forward during the knife geometry discussion, inhaled slowly through his nose and then looked at the ceiling as though something interesting was happening up there. Growth said nothing. Cal set the sword against the bench, pulled out a small pan, lit the portable burner, and started working. Growth watched for approximately 45 seconds before his pride lost a brief internal argument, and he said, "What is that?" Not a question. Growth did not ask questions. It came out as a statement with a questioning shape. "Grain and protein," Cal said, not looking up. "I have got some dried herbs from the Makav border region, a little rendered fat, and some salt I picked up at Juno Outpost that is technically not cleared for trade, but is also incredible. Nothing fancy. Just something my father made when the budget was low and the shift was long." Growth processed this. "You are cooking," he said. "A poor man's meal." "The best kind," Cal said. "Rich people eat for status. Poor people eat because they are hungry. Hunger is a much better seasoning." The soldier second from the left said, "What is the herb from Makov called?" 6 heads turned toward him. He returned to looking at the ceiling. Growth said nothing, but he took 1 step closer to the workbench. Pip said, very quietly, so that only Cal could hear through the earpiece, "I want you to know that I have completely lost track of how this is supposed to end, and I am just watching now." Cal cooked the way people cook when they are not performing for anyone, which is to say, he cooked well. There was no showmanship, no commentary, no explanation of technique offered to the 7 armed aliens standing in his cargo bay watching him with the confused intensity of individuals whose morning had gone significantly off script. There was just the sound of fat hitting a hot pan, the smell of dried herbs opening up in the heat, and the particular rhythm of someone who had learned to cook not in a kitchen, but in a series of small, inconvenient spaces where the margin between a good meal and a bad one was almost entirely down to attention. He used Korovax once more, not dramatically. He just needed to rough cut the protein strips, and the sword's blade, wiped clean on a cloth he pulled from his back pocket, was still the most useful thing in the room for the job. He did it the way you use a good tool when a good tool is available, efficiently and without making a speech about it. Groth watched the sword being used as a kitchen implement and opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Then he looked at the pan. Then he forgot what he was going to say. The smell was doing something to the room that Groth's entrance had failed to do. It was making everyone present stop thinking about where they were supposed to be and simply exist in the place they actually were. This is what good food does. It is deeply inconvenient and entirely unavoidable. The soldier second from the left, whose name Cal would eventually learn, was Drevg, had given up all pretense of maintaining formation and was now standing close enough to the burner that Cal had to ask him to shift left twice. Cal plated the food in the only vessels he had available, which were 4 mismatched bowls, 2 flat cargo lids he had cleaned with the same cloth as the sword, and 1 container that was technically rated for storing coolant fluid but had never been used for that purpose. He was not embarrassed about this. You work with what is in front of you. That is the whole job. He set everything out on the flat top of a cargo crate, which became a table by simply being the surface the food was on. Cal pulled up a crate for himself, sat down, and started eating. He did not invite anyone. He did not make a gesture. He did not say anything at all. This, as it turned out, was exactly the right move. Drevg sat down first. He did it quickly, like a man committing to a decision before he could think about it too hard, and he pulled one of the cargo lid plates toward himself and looked at it and then looked at Cal, and Cal nodded once and Drevg ate. The sound he made was not a word. It was not really a sound a translator could do much with. But the meaning was perfectly clear across every known language barrier, because it was the sound a person makes when something is better than they were prepared for and their body has reacted before their brain could manage the situation. 2 more soldiers sat down. Then 2 more. The 6th sat down and then looked at Groth with the expression of a man who had just realized he had done something that might be a problem but could not bring himself to undo it. Groth stood at the edge of the crate table. He was still holding Korovax, which Cal had handed back to him after the second use, and he looked at the remaining portion on the makeshift serving lid, and he looked at his soldiers, and he looked at the human who was eating calmly and not looking at him at all. Cal poured a small amount of the pan liquid over the remaining portion. It was a simple thing, a finishing move, the kind of small, deliberate act that signals a cook considers the food worth the extra step. Groth sat down. He sat down the way a man sits when he is going to maintain that he is still standing, technically, in every way that matters. He positioned Korovax across his knees. He kept his posture. He took the portion that remained. He ate. The cargo bay was completely silent, except for the small sounds of a meal being consumed. No weapons. No posturing. No rehearsed speeches about bloodlines or conquered systems. Just 7 Vorkai soldiers and their supreme warlord sitting on cargo crates in a hauler called the Midden, eating a poor man's dish made with a borrowed ancestral sword and ingredients that had no registered trade value. Pip, who had been silent for an unprecedented 11 minutes, said softly, "Cal, I have run this situation through every scenario model I have, and I genuinely cannot tell you what happens next. I just want you to know that. For my own peace of mind." Cal finished his bowl. Groth had not spoken since sitting down. He ate slowly, with the focused attention of someone giving a thing the respect it deserved. When he finished, he set the cargo lid down carefully, which was more care than the cargo lid had ever received in its operational life. And he sat with his hands on Korovac's and said nothing. The silence from Groth was a different quality than his earlier silences. His earlier silences had been tools, deliberate gaps designed to let threat and gravity fill the space. This silence was not designed. This silence was what happens when a person is having a genuine experience and does not yet have the correct words for it and is too honest, underneath everything, to reach for the wrong ones. Cal waited. He was good at waiting. Groth said, "In 3 campaigns across 6 systems, I have eaten at the tables of conquered governors. I have been served by trained chefs on plundered stations. I have consumed things that cost more than most ships." He paused. "This is dried grain, protein strips, herbs from a border region, and salt of questionable legal status." Another pause. "It is the finest thing I have eaten in 11 years. Dreft nodded with the solemn enthusiasm of a man who had been thinking the same thing and was relieved someone with authority had said it first. Groth looked at Cal. "I do not understand you," he said. It was not an insult. It was, coming from Groth, something much closer to a genuine admission. Cal shrugged. "Most people do not. I am just hungry a lot." The boarding withdrawal took approximately 4 minutes to process officially. This was fast, by Vorkai standards. Vorkai withdrawals typically involved formal documentation, a recitation of terms, and at least one speech. Groth skipped the speech, which his soldiers noted privately and would discuss among themselves for weeks afterward. Not critically. More with the quiet satisfaction of people who had sat through a great many speeches and found the absence of one, on this particular occasion, to be the correct call. Groth stood, straightened his armor, and took a long moment to reassemble the version of himself that had walked through the breach in the first place. It did not quite fit the same way it had an hour ago. Things that have eaten well tend to sit differently than things that have not. This is true of people. It is apparently also true of supreme warlords of the Third Vorkai Dominion. He held out Korovac's, hilt first. Cal took it, wiped it down one final time with the cloth, checked the edge out of professional habit, nodded in genuine appreciation at the craftsmanship, and handed it back properly. Both hands. A small thing. Groth noticed it. "The blade held up well," Cal said. "Good steel. Or whatever the Vorkai equivalent is. Your 7 generations knew their metallurgy." "They did," Groth said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite pride and not quite warmth, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Then Groth reached into the interior of his armor and produced a seal. Not a metaphorical seal. A physical object, flat and hexagonal, deep red, with the Vorkai Dominion crest pressed into its surface in a material that caught the cargo bay light the same way Korovac's had. He held it out. Cal looked at it. "That is a Vorkai Safe Passage seal," Pip said through the cockpit speaker, in the voice of someone reading information they cannot quite believe they are reading. "Cal, that is, do you know what that is worth? Cal, in trade value alone, that is. I am looking at the numbers right now, and I need you to understand that I am having a moment." "I heard you, Pip." 11 years of cargo fees," Pip said. Conservatively, Cal. Cal took the seal. He turned it over once in his hand, the same way he had examined the sword, with simple and genuine attention. And then he looked at Groth. "This is too much for a meal," Cal said. And he meant it. There was no angle in it. No performance of humility designed to extract a better offer. He simply meant it, which was, in Groth's considerable experience of humans and non-humans alike, across 6 conquered systems, almost entirely unprecedented. Groth looked at him for a moment. "It is not payment for the meal," Groth said carefully. "It is acknowledgement that you did not behave as expected in a situation that called for expected behavior, and that the result was," he paused, choosing the word with visible deliberateness, "instructive." Cal thought about this. "All right," he said, and put the seal in his jacket pocket with the same energy a man puts his keys away, like it was simply the next thing that had happened. Groth almost smiled. It did not quite complete itself, because growth was growth, and certain muscles had not been used in that particular configuration for some time and needed more notice. But the shape of it was there, briefly, at the corner of his mouth, before he reassembled his expression into something more appropriate for a supreme warlord who had places to be. "The recipe," Growth said. "Right." Cal tore a strip from the corner of his cargo manifest, which was the only paper immediately available, and wrote it out from memory. Quantities, order of operations, the note about rendering the fat low and slow before anything else went in, the specific window for the herbs, the finishing step with the pan liquid. He wrote it the way his father had told it to him, which was without measurements, because his father had not cooked with measurements. And neither did Cal. He wrote it in the language of someone who trusted the person reading it to pay attention. At the bottom, he added a note about the blade technique, spine thickness, angle of approach, how to read the resistance of the casing before committing to the split. 3 lines, practical and specific. He handed it to Growth. Growth read it. Then he read the blade note. Then he folded it, with more care than the scrap of cargo manifest paper technically warranted, and placed it inside his armor. Drevk, standing 2 steps behind Growth and making absolutely no attempt to pretend he had not been listening, said, "The herb from Makov. What was it called?" "Sorvel," Cal said. "Dried. You want fresh if you can find it, but dried is fine. Do not use the powdered version, it goes bitter and fat." Drev committed this to memory with the expression of a man filing something important. Growth turned toward the breach. His soldiers fell into formation behind him, though the formation had a slightly looser quality than the one they had arrived in. The sharp geometry of a rehearsed intimidation had given way to something more like a group of people who had shared a table and were now going back to their respective days. At the breach, Groth stopped. He did not turn around fully. Just enough. "Rayo," he said. "Yeah," Cal said. "The salt," Growth said. "The one of questionable legal status." "From Juno Outpost," Cal said. "Buy more." Then he walked through the breach, and the Vorkai boarded their ship, and the clamps released, and the warship pulled away from the midden with the slow, powerful indifference of something that could destroy Cal's ship 11 times over and had simply chosen not to today, which was, when you thought about it, a very generous use of a Tuesday afternoon. The cargo bay was quiet. Cal picked up the mismatched bowls and the cargo lids and the coolant container and stacked them next to the portable burner. He would wash them later. He looked at the crack in the grain casing where Kurovax had split it, and at the remaining portion still sitting on the workbench, and decided he had enough for one more bowl if he stretched it. He lit the burner again. Pip said, "Cal?" "Yeah. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "Go ahead." "Did you know," Pip said, "at any point during the last hour and a half, how close we were to being destroyed by a Vorkai boarding party?" Cal thought about this. Not for long. He was already adding the last of the herbs to the pan. "Yes," he said. Pip processed this. "And?" Cal looked at the pan. The fat was moving the way it was supposed to. The herbs were opening up. The smell filled the cargo bay again. Smaller this time, just for one person, but no less honest for it. "And I was hungrier," Cal said. Pip was quiet for a moment. Then Pip said, "I am going to file that under leadership philosophy and leave it alone." "Good call," Cal said. He ate his second bowl, standing at the workbench, in a ship called the Midden, in a sector so economically irrelevant that even pirates avoided it, with a hexagonal Vorkai safe passage seal, worth 11 years of cargo fees sitting in his jacket pocket, next to a receipt from Harkin Station and a pen that no longer worked. It was, by any reasonable standard, a very good morning.